Okay. Okay, here we are, recording in progress, it says. After I had just written so persuasively this week against the use of the word progress. But so anyway, what can I do? Can I say? Well, Father is telling me that you all have been studying the fruit of the Spirit. And so I thought I would not disrupt that, but he tells me that I am going to be talking about one of them out of order. The passage in Galatians 5, where St. Paul lists the fruit of the Spirit, has long been a favorite passage for me. So I was telling Father, back in my youthful Jesus freak days, I lived in the commune for a couple of years, and we had all kinds of little scripture ditties that people had set to music, and so we would memorize scripture by learning these little songs. And years later, when I was training to be an Episcopal priest, I had to take an exam for called your ordination exam. And somewhere in the course of the closed book section of the exam, it said, describe and discuss the contents of the book of Galatians. You know, and they're probably looking for anybody who could say, well, it's about freedom, and you would pass. But as it was, I had so much of it memorized from my little song ditties. I pretty well, wrote out the book of Galatians and added a few comments on it that way, and managed to pass it despite all of the other deficiencies. But it was so neat to look at one and thought, I know this one. I know this one. My favorite book. So what I want to talk to you about this evening is about the fruit of the Spirit, which Paul names as meekness. It's interesting, this whole thing about the list of the fruit of the Spirit. You can go into the fathers, especially at the Desert Fathers, and the traditions that developed out of that, and like the Cappadocians, and the early spiritual writers in the church, and you won't find much made of this. What does happen is that largely they take the list of the virtues, as had been discussed mostly in Platonic philosophy. That is, in that sense, it's like, oh no, they're looking at Greek philosophy. Actually, when they're looking at Greek philosophy, they're also looking at the common knowledge of the culture. In other words, if everybody in the culture grew up talking about a list of virtues, then you didn't have to just wipe those away, say, no, we've got this passage in Galatians 5. No, instead, you work at them and meld them. And of course, actually, Christians oftentimes redefined the terms. Pagans would say the one thing about them, and the Christians would redefine them. Some of the great early Christian writers, like Dionysius the Areopagite, who wrote 500, 600s or so, maybe 4. His whole project was taking the sort of the cultural Platonism and reworking it into Christian terms, and it became the dominant form of the treatment of those early things that go later. So I'm going to be doing something of the same thing tonight. Instead of talking exactly about meekness, a couple of things I will say about just the term meekness is there's 2 prominent places where it gets mentioned in scriptures. One is it speaks of meekness with regard to Moses. The Old Testament says that Moses was the meekest man on the face of the earth. And I don't know about you, but it's hard for me to picture Charlton Heston as meek about anything. I mean, they could have cast John Wayne and it still wouldn't be believable. I mean, he's like that, and it just doesn't. And the closest, there was a one done later with Ben Kingsley playing Moses. And since he had done Gandhi, it worked sort of well for Moses, but because he's sort of a meekish kind of guy. And so he's not exactly my Moses. I just had Charlton Heston in my head since I was a little boy back in the 50s. But you don't think of meekness. And so did Moses, the meekest man on the face of the earth. Not bad. And Jesus says of himself, learn from me, for I am meek and lowly. What I've come to understand is, in fact, not only is Moses the meekest man on the face of the earth, and Christ is meek, it's actually extremely accurate to say that God is meek. Now, I'm going to translate and use a more common word because we don't actually talk about meekness much. Mostly when we say meekness in modern parlance, we mean by that that someone who won't speak up. She sits in the back of the class and she's very meek. It's not, you wouldn't say that, oh, she's so meek. You wouldn't say that as a compliment about anybody. I want to translate it and use the term humble and humility, which, you read through the fruit of the Spirit and you think, Paul, where is humility? Why doesn't that come in there? Well, it is there. It's there under the word meekness. It's about as close as he uses to it. And if you were to study and think about meekness, it's very much what humility is. And of course, in the second chapter of Philippians, St. Paul will talk about the humility of Christ, or we use the word humility to describe it, and Paul is telling us to have the same mind that Christ had. That's Philippians 2:5, the mind that is ours in Christ Jesus, who though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God as something to cling to, but instead emptied himself. Kenao in Greek, he empties himself and becomes obedient to death, and not just death, but obedient to death on the cross, which is, I say that to Western ears, especially at this time of year, and Westerners hear especially death on the cross, and we think painful death. I don't know if any of y'all who may have grown up with in an evangelical background, like I did, little Baptist boy, and they take you off to camp at some point. While you're off in summer camp, they've got to do at least one day dedicated to getting you saved. And so I can remember those days because I went to those camps a lot, and there would be someone come in to do the graphic talk on crucifixion, and they describe what happens with the nails and the whole thing, and how you die of asphyxiation. It's just awful. And it's kind of spelled out as graphically as it can be. And you got the impression that this was the worst possible way that you could die. And it had to be the worst possible way you could die, since he was dying for all of us. Or as my baby daughter, not your wife, but my baby daughter, Claire, tells me the story. She was out here and a friend here in Memphis, evangelical friend, took her to her evangelical megachurch for Good Friday one year here. And my daughter was so upset, she called her mama. She said, Mama, she had no evangelical experience at all, poor darling. She grew up Episcopalian until she was 6, and then she became Orthodox. She just never seen this stuff. And they did the graphic crucifixions thing. She said, and just kept telling us that we were guilty for having done this to Jesus. And then they wanted my email address. and my wife said, well, what did you do? She goes, I took her home. And she said, I had to show her Orthodox Good Friday. She had never seen that. She was telling her mother with tears, she goes, I have to come home for Pascha. And I thought, raise them up in the way they should go, and it just took an evangelical to wake her up to come back home, and where we won't make her feel so bad about having killed Jesus. And what's interesting is St. Paul, and I'm doing some talks on this in other places these days, St. Paul in Philippians 2 concentrates on what is very much the Orthodox take on the crucifixion. And that isn't that it's the painful death, it's even death on the cross, because it's a shameful death. Cursed is anyone who dies, who hangs on a tree. It was a cursed death, the death of a criminal. Not only a cursed death, it is probably a naked death. He's stripped, he's beaten. All of these things that violate the public norms that are done. But as deaths go, he's only there 3 hours. He's only on the cross 3 hours. He dies so fast, they don't even break his legs. He's already dead. They do pierce his side. But as deaths go, I've presided. I have ministered at hundreds of deaths. I worked for a few years as a hospice chaplain. And I watch people die after, say, 6 months of bone cancer, and a crucifixion would have been a great mercy by comparison. As pain goes, it's probably one of the more painful deaths anyone has to endure. Very difficult. And so I've always found it almost an insult to talk about 3 hours of crucifixion in the face of someone that I'm looking and thinking, I know what your mama went through this year. And I'm not going to try to tell you that this was somehow harder than what your mama endured. The difference would be is if your mama had to do it naked in the front yard and everybody could come by and watch her. This is, everybody in Jerusalem out there wagging. And when we get to Orthodox Holy Week, if you pay attention carefully this year, you'll notice what we say in all of these hymns. It's not about pain. It's all about the mocking and the spitting. As it says in Isaiah 50, I turn not my face from the shame and the spitting. This is the humility of God. And in fact, that humility begins not simply that he empties himself to take the form of a servant and be crucified in this shameful death of the cross. He emptied himself when he entered the virgin's womb to become human in the first place. He took on himself everything that is ours, that he might unite himself to us, because we weren't going to become that which was worthy to be united with him. He created us for union with him. He created us for communion with him. And so he came to find us. He came to get us. And where were we? Where, when he was looking for Adam the first time, Adam, where are you? Where was he? Naked, hiding with Eve, in her first little sewing project, little fig leaf thing that wasn't very good. And God gave them, I always call them Flintstone outfits. It says he gave them garments of skin. And I kind of imagine them. Now the Greek fathers imagined all kinds of like mystical interpretations of the garments of skin. And I think, no, this is like Fred and Wilma. And, at least in the first pass on Genesis, that's probably what the writer had in mind. I'm sure it does have lots of mystical meanings, but he comes where we are looking for us. And St. Paul says that we should have this same mind in ourselves, who did not, that is to have in us the humility of Christ. The fathers later on, a number of them say that humility is the queen of all the virtues, that it's humility that begets all the other virtues that come from that. In many ways, it's easy for me to, for instance, to see love. How can love get a foothold except I empty myself towards the other person? Love that doesn't put the other person first, that isn't, in a sense, emptying itself towards the other. The Father empties himself towards the Son empties himself towards the Father. The Holy Spirit, Scripture says, won't even speak of the things concerning himself, but he glorifies the Son. The utter humility in the persons of the Trinity is just this mutual self-emptying and self-giving. And Christ comes among us and shows us this. So it's not surprising to discover that humility is the queen of the virtues, this meekness. Now, having said that, I've got a book coming out next month, and it's ostensibly on shame. At least that's on the title. It's called Face to Face, Knowing God Beyond Our Shame. But I told somebody, ultimately, it's about humility. But if I put humility in the title, I think everybody would be afraid to buy it. It's like nobody wants to be humble. Everybody looks at shame and thinks, I think I need to read that one, because we've all got our shame issues. You might want to get a, brown paper bag and read it quietly so nobody can see it, and realize that you got shame issues. But you do, whether you know it or not. Adam and Eve had them. They saw they were naked and they were ashamed. The first emotion recorded to human beings comes after the fall, and it is shame. Shame is not sin. It's we're hardwired for it. You have these little babies. Mama brings baby up to communion, or godmother brings the baby up to communion in the arms, little toddler. You're trying to give them communion, and suddenly they look at the priest and burst into tears and hide their face. Turn it into that's actually they're experiencing the neurobiological reaction that you and I feel as shame. You want to hide your face. You go into a room, you don't know anybody, or somebody does something embarrassing or embarrasses you, you hide your face, you turn away, you blush. We feel it in the face. Even an infant will do that. I kind of did an experiment because I had a couple of these at church, and that was if I could try to give them communion without making eye contact with them at first, because they come up and you make eye contact with them, and certainly, boom, it's because eye contact is it normally is an invitation to communion, and they're fine with it with mama, but a stranger, you're a threat. And so they feel vulnerable, and the feeling of vulnerability is the experience of shame. You want to hide. Well, all of that's completely innocent when you're a child, and and generally innocent for us when we're feeling a little embarrassment walking into a room full of strangers or something like that. But oftentimes what we experience with shame is really quite painful, and leaves us sort of hardly able to move. And some people, if they've gone through trauma or abuse and things like that, have suffered from what's called toxic shame, and it's just unbearable, and can even mark a personality in some really, really dark ways, and be a source of a lot of other things, panic disorders, depression, many, many other things connected with this. So it's very deep. As I've studied and worked with this, it's been something that's really been informing my thoughts about pastoral ministry, and particularly about my own life. In terms, I'm retired now, so mostly all I have to do is I'm just kind of cramming for my finals, Judgment Day, and so it's like I don't have anything better to do than become a better man. It's a shame I didn't start sooner, but I need to be looking at it now. And a lot of these is sort of just paying attention to things. I told someone the other day that the older I get, the worse I become as a priest. And what I mean by that is I used to think I was really good at it. Now I don't think so at all. In fact, I'm very, very aware of terrible mistakes I made along and along. And can't believe I said that. Can't believe I did that. I'm coming to understand it. Father Zacharias of Essex, who was the disciple of Saint Sophrony, has in a number of his books, but especially his book, The Enlargement of the Heart, has a lot to say about shame and relays some of what Saint Sophrony taught about it. When Father Zacharias and some of the other priests in the monastery were preparing to begin the ministry of hearing confessions, Saint Sophrony told him, he said, especially with the young, when you're hearing confessions, he said, teach them to bear a little shame. I've heard it said in a different way. The monk, Father Seraphim, who is a Romanian monk, who's at the monastery in Scotland on the Isle of Mull, he said his Romanian confessor told him, be sure when you come to me to confession to tell me something that you think will make me think less of you. There's things that I had not told a confessor. I started making confessions in my 20s when I was an Episcopalian. And it continued. There's things that I didn't mention in confession until I was 58 years old, because I couldn't. All the theology in the world could not bring me to. And the interesting things is the things I couldn't say when I was 58 had not been my fault. And so for years I said to myself, well, it's not my fault. I don't need to say anything about that. I didn't do anything wrong. But I couldn't say it, which is to say, I could not bear it. I could not be that naked. And I kind of decided at 58 with some other things going in my life that if I didn't talk about that now, whenever was I going to do it, So Saint Sophrony said, God never judges twice. And what I learned from it is, though it wasn't my fault, it was a seed of darkness, and it played out many, many ways in my life, and it really helped me begin to follow that. And so I began in some very, very safe places, actually with a therapist before I could ever do it with a priest. I don't know, it just felt different. But if I didn't like it, I could fire the therapist. But being able to break the silence, and to be that person, to acknowledge that wound, that brokenness, was a huge help in my life, huge help personally. Still something I deal with every day in various ways, and in others that I'm only just beginning to see. But the key, as Sophrony said, teach them to bear a little shame. Key there is the emphasis on the word little, not like all of it. We do sometimes like a life confession before, chrismation or kind of being received into the church. And I tell people, yes, sort of. You may not be really you may not be ready for your whole life confession with the capital L, and we may not have time. uh, do your highlights, and we'll work on it, but don't do it like you never get to do it again. You're gonna, and hit the highlights, and we'll work at this. But I mean, for one thing is that these things can be such terrible vulnerabilities. As I said, I was 58. That's 38 years of my life. I couldn't talk about it. I could not talk about it. I couldn't have gotten the words out of my mouth. And it wasn't until the time was right, God was right, and I was right, and the setting was there, and the invitation allowed it to take place. And there can be things like that for all of us. And what's interesting to me is, as I've kind of worked beyond that and kind of continued that as a model of trying to approach my confessions, that you begin to see how it is that bearing a little shame becomes the mother or the queen of the virtues. I ran across and some of the research I did when I was writing this book, I ran across a secular sociologist team writing about shame, and described shame as the master emotion. I thought, oh, that's interesting. It's the queen of virtues, but it's also the master emotion. If you kind of get into it, it's in your day every day. It is the emotion, even in its lighter forms, is the emotion that signals boundaries. Let's take you back to walking in that party full of strangers. You come in the door and you look. If you're a woman, your first thought is, what are they wearing? Forgive me, I've got a wife. I know these things. What are they? I used to get this too. Someone called the church, want to come visit, and the voice on the other end, female voice on the other end of the phone. What do the women wear? Because they're all thinking you have to dress like a Russian babushka to come to church at OCA church. And I think, no, they wear pants. Most of them don't cover their heads, and nowadays it's almost like I have no idea, but just show up. But that question, what are they wearing? What are they drinking? How are they behaving? There's a whole range of things, and you can oftentimes scan a room, in a half a second. You see it, and you're checking things. If you think to yourself, I'm dressed the wrong way, you might think, I need to find a way to graciously get out of here real quick, because I just don't think I can be that badly dressed in this situation. Who told you that? Well, I mean, you're not exactly feeling embarrassed, but shame is telling you that, or it's telling you to relax. It's telling you lots of things. Sometimes it may be telling you things like, don't raise your hand. You may have sat through all those classes all that time and never raised your hand. Why? Because you could not bear the attention. Why? You didn't feel like that person, whatever. I was always that boy in the front of the row with his hand up all the time. Couldn't shut me up. And you've spent days with me, and you know how that goes. So, well, I discovered years later that my mother had ADHD, which explained a lot. I told my children in my 50s when the doctor diagnosed me with ADHD, and I told my adult children, and they all started laughing, and they said, Papa, you didn't know that? Everybody knows that about you. So, which was a great shame moment. It's like, oh my God, they noticed, It's like, they not only noticed, it's like you're wearing a clown nose and you're surprised that nobody had mentioned it to you. You just are, I was with Father John and some others on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. It was there for 10 days with Metropolitan Callistos Ware, who must have gone home thinking, my God, he would never shut up. And I just look back now and think, it's the queen of the virtues. So, it's interesting. In Orthodoxy, I've got a chapter on this in the book. In Orthodoxy, probably the greatest model of holiness we have is the model of the holy fool. I mean, haven't you read the book Laurus? I mean, it's a magnificent book, and it's almost a composite of various lives of holy fools all worked together into a single story. It's like taking you inside the life of a holy fool, but it's a shame-bearing story if ever there was one. and and it's true of them. But so many of the holy fools in Russia would go about naked. And I'm just thinking, well, you got to be holy or something to do winters in Moscow naked on the street. Either that or just numb. But these stories, and they do this. St. Paul said, he coined the term fools for Christ. He says of we apostles, we are fools for Christ. And they had a sense that this foolishness, which is always shame-inducing, it's not really foolishness if it doesn't. This foolishness they're willing to practice is an imitation of the foolishness of Christ, who for our sake became a fool. That everyone looks at him and he'll say, Paul will talk about it in 2 Corinthians, that the Greeks call the cross foolishness, and the Jews call it weakness. And so we become foolish and we become weak because we want to become like Christ crucified. And so we practice these little forms of humility. And it really, as virtues go, it really differs from person to person. You can have a lot of things about it, but it really differs somewhat from person to person. I mean, some of that is actually kind of knowing what your vulnerability is. What is it that makes you want to run and hide, or just avoid that topic, or avoid that setting? What is it that you could name in your life? There may be some of them you think, not again, not doing that again. I'll never go there. It's, various things that people have. You get stories like someone will go to visit an Orthodox church and they're not welcome, and oftentimes when they're describing it, the experience of going somewhere as a stranger and not being welcome is a shaming experience. Come to our church, we'll make you a fool for Jesus. It's difficult. It's an awful lot to ask of them. We should be the fools that are, willing to, as Paul would say, you see the poor come in and you don't tell him to take the lowest seat, you put him at the highest seat. You make the rich man take the lowest seat. Why? The rich man needs it real bad because he's not getting it all day long. He needs to come to church and take that low seat. He needs to learn to bear a little humility. I think one of the things that I appreciate most, though, in Galatians is that Paul underlines these and calls them the fruit of the Spirit. These are not the fruit of our human efforts. And even if we're working at practicing humility by bearing a little shame, even when we're doing that, it's God who gives us the growth in it. And which is part of why I tell somebody, don't do something you're not ready to do. Don't, you take it easy. God will give you the grace. God will, open doors for you. He will show you how to take these steps, and he'll give you the benefit that comes from them. We're not earning any of this. Not just that, but when it comes to this stuff, my experience has been that on the whole, God gives me enough stuff to feel ashamed about on a day-to-day basis that I'm surprised I've not entered full theosis yet. But just close. Sorry. Just close. But there's usually enough things in our life. I don't know about you, but there's usually enough sin, and sin is oftentimes something that we do feel ashamed of. I can't believe I did that. There's an example. Can't believe I did that. And it happens, any number of times. We want to be well thought of. Instead, I hear that Romanian priest saying, "Tell me something that you think will make me think less of you." And I love. There was a couple of guys in Oregon. One of them, they were evangelical pastors together, and one of them got interested in orthodoxy. And he was from East Tennessee originally, and somehow or another he started listening to my podcast and reading my blog and things like that, and mostly reading the blog, which makes me sound intellectual in a way that I'm not. And anyway, he left his pastoring and moved to East Tennessee, wanted to become Orthodox. He started attending St. Anne's. And about a month later, he told me, he said, he told me all of this leading up to it. He said, I called my buddy back in Oregon, where I was, and I said to him, I've met Father Stephen. The other guy said, wow, what's he like? He said, he's a redneck. And this guy, God bless him, his family is from East Tennessee and down like about Cleveland, which is Church of God headquarters. I mean, nobody's a redneck like a Pentecostal redneck. Baptists never ever got to be red as a Pentecostal. It's just, they all sorted that way. And so that's his background. And and he wasn't in a Pentecostal church in Oregon, but I loved it. I said to him, you absolutely understand me. I feel so comfortable with him. We get together and pick guitar some now and sing gospel songs and enjoy ourselves and, share our life neck to neck. And, but some of that is, I remember some years ago, we were first starting our mission in Knoxville, and with me as a kind of a renegade from the Episcopalians. And somewhere or another in my first year or so, in the course of a homily, with usual humor, referred to us as Appalachian Orthodox. And I had several of our folks get upset. They were not from East Tennessee, who got upset with me and did not want to be called Appalachian anything. And I think they were from New Jersey. And I thought, Yankee Orthodox? I don't know. But, I thought, you don't really understand the miraculous work God is doing here. He's bringing Appalachians into Orthodoxy, and we're going to embarrass the daylights out of you. It's part of who we are. And those of us, we converts coming in. I did a chapter on the shame of conversion, another place to find humility and to practice it towards them. To come into a church and be a convert is to have to bear a little shame because you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing. You start to cross yourself and you think everybody in the congregation's watching you, and am I doing it right? I was recently watching a young woman catechumen in our church, and she's crossing herself with her left hand, right shoulder, left shoulder. And I'm watching it, and I thought, somebody's got to tell her. Somebody's got to tell her. And if I don't, one of these Russian grandmothers is going to clean her clock, and she may not be prepared for that and may not come back. And I very quietly took her aside and told her a funny story about that and some other things, and shared some embarrassing moments in my life and taught her how to cross herself the right way. I saw her last Sunday. She said to me, I've remembered when you told me, and I do it every time. I said, you're just fine. It's just, I don't think anybody but me and you noticed, so it's okay. But bless her heart. I mean, that's a hard thing to do, to come in. You're a teenager. She was probably already thinking everybody was watching her. And one of the priests, the old geezer priest, saw you and came to you. I did try to be as humble about it as possible, but it's hard. Not just that, but we converts are really upsetting to the cradles. You may not have many of them here, but occasionally I read articles, written by, either cradles or those who've been in so long they think they're cradles, and and fussing about our politics or something else. They're worried coming in. And I told someone for the Orthodox in the United States, they only recently arrived in America, because so long as their churches were ethnically Orthodox, they didn't have any Americans in them. And so you don't know. I mean, I knew lots of Greek priests who didn't have any idea what Protestants believe. No idea at all. They never talked with one, just as clueless as can be, not even certain about what Catholics believed, and except some rumors from their grandmother or something. And they just don't know. And suddenly here we are flooding the churches. 25% of the priests in the Greek archdiocese are converts. Most of the seminarians in our seminaries are converts, and we're baptizing their children and grandchildren and stuff. We've come in, but also with it, some of us have brought our Protestant ways. God bless you. God bless the EOC that came into the Antiochian Archdiocese and thought it was okay to be evangelical with the gospel of Jesus Christ. They helped you all, this church in particular, strong part of it, helped transform the face of Orthodoxy in America. It was time. The time was ripe, and God brought it in when the time was ripe. But part of what's been going on and our beloved orthodoxies. Orthodoxy is discovering America, and America's a mess. America is a religious mess. We have a long history all the way going back to England of a religious mess. It got so bad at one point, they cut off the king's head. They outlawed the bishops in the Book of Common Prayer. They outlawed Christmas and Easter at one point, and that was just the 1600s. And then they sent them over to America to come do it over here. And that was Massachusetts. That was all, those pilgrims, 1620. They were not happy Christians. They were mean. But we're a mess, but we're coming into orthodoxy, and it's a messy thing. But welcome to America. And you have to bear a little shame. You have to do that. And God bless the priests and bishops who had the vision and the tolerance to put up with us, to bring us in, clean us up a little bit, get us to cross ourselves the right way. And my mom and dad converted when they were 79. And their OCA priest, long story, the short version, priest called me, said, "Your dad called me." I said, "I thought he would." He said, "What'll I do with them?" They were fleeing the Episcopal Church, and it was all done for them. And I said, "Well, they're 79. I don't think," and they were country people. I said, "I don't think you can teach them anything." I said, "But if you get them to cross themselves the right way, hear their confession and chrismatum, they'll never leave you. They'll never leave you." My dad's first Lent, he calls me up third Sunday, said, "Son, they brought out the cross today." I said, "Yes, Dad, it's third Sunday." He said, "Well, I wanted to get down." I said, "Yeah." He said, "They had to get me back up." And, you got to love a man like that, who's willing to abase himself before the cross. But he'd sung it for years as a Baptist, "Beneath thy cross," and therefore form that they sing it, we sing in a different way. But to humble himself before the cross, even if I've got to help you get back up, he was pleased. And him, he was an Orthodox man when they died. God bless him. But our willingness to do this, it is a small thing. It's not like suddenly that you have to become, a fool for Christ. But in small ways, you'll find the path to humility in the things that can make you very uncomfortable, in small things of shame, and and in bearing them in the presence of God. Maybe just even in doing an examination of conscience before communion, or before confession, to be able to say, this was not a big deal this week, but as the week went, when that happened, I was absolutely mortified. And you may very well look at it and say, "Well, I didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't your fault, but, take courage, bring that." Because part of what's happening to us is that through humility, and as we gain these virtues, we're doing what Adam and Eve could not do. We're being able to come back to stand naked before God, that is in the utter and complete truth of our being, without shame or fear. I'll wrap this with a little image that is sweet to me, and that's the imagery of clothing. God clothes Adam and Eve with their garments of skin, their Flintstone outfits. But this becomes a theme throughout Scripture. You read the Old Testament and the clothing of the priest. The priest entering into the Holy of Holies to make sacrifice and atonement one day out of the year. He's entering paradise. The Holy of Holies is entering paradise again. It's the place, if he goes in wrongly, God will kill him. They tied a rope around his ankle so that he went in. If there was a problem and God killed him, they couldn't go in to get him, so they would drag him back out. But he's going in there to stand before God. To stand before God. So this is, God clothes him. We get this, we get clothed when we are baptized. As many as have been baptized into Christ have put on. Literally, it is to be endued, has been put Jesus on as a clothing. Put on your Jesus suit. Clothed with the righteousness of Christ. Paul says that I might be found not with my own righteousness, not these rags, but the righteousness of Christ who clothes me with this. Or for those of you who've been ordained, that unbelievable experience of the bishop clothing you, the diaconate or the priesthood, I was telling my wife about this. I still see Vladika Dimitri's hands and his fingers. The last thing I remember seeing of him and kissing his hands in the coffin as they laid him to rest, but holding up my vestments and calling to the congregation, Oxios, which means he is worthy, and having a whole church full of people chanting, he is worthy, he is worthy, he is worthy. Well, and jolly well, you're not even close to it, but it's like, it's a picture of heaven, because Jesus is going to clothe you before his great judgment seat. He's going to clothe you. This is a promise given to us, and he's going to write a name on you. His own name, it says in Revelation, to write his name on your forehead. And I can very well imagine him saying, Oxios, he's worthy. He's worthy, which gives us a chance to say he's worthy back to him. And we just have just a great worthy time together. But this is, you can't know the joy of being clothed without knowing the shame of being naked. And we do those things. God has given us the instruments of our salvation in the life of the church, particularly in the life of the sacraments, as we practice them. That dear man, my dad, as I told his priest, hear his confession, he had struggled early on in my mom and dad's married life. In my childhood, struggled with alcoholism. I remember watching that man walk the aisle one day in a Baptist church to give his life to Christ. He'd been busted DUI earlier in the week and spent a night in jail, and it really worked a hard thing on him. And so he went, gave his life to Christ yet again, same church. And he told the preacher that he wanted to make a confession before the congregation, which is not how they do things in that little Baptist church, but the preacher let him. And I watched my dad make a public confession and think, you want to talk about bearing it all for Jesus' sake? He wanted to be healed, sober, and restored to his right mind so bad he would do even that. It lasted for 6 months, which was a long time in those days. He later found all of that later in his life, and not just sobriety, but a lot more. But the truth is that the wonder of his heart was already present years ago. He just needed a safe place and the right tools and spiritual training to deal with someone who was broken the way he was. He'd grown up in the Depression with nothing. Daddy was a sharecropper. That's as hard as it got in the South in the 20s and 30s. So, and you just have to learn to bear it and get through it. God healed him. So each of us, we have our stories, we have our shame, and it is a path to meekness. Moses had his. He had to get over the arrogance of being a prince of Egypt. Had to do that and all that it meant. Jesus, from the get-go, bore the shame of his humanity, found in Adam's skin, found in what looked like Adam's clothes, and bearing all of that, and even finally answering for Adam's sin and everybody's. This is Jesus on the cross. So anyway, I'll stop there, and if we've got any questions, thoughts, or anything else I can do with that. I'm not timing this, so I don't know. Oh, good. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me, Father.
No.
I'm the most ignorant person in this room. When you were talking earlier about your shame,
Yeah.
I've never heard anybody say that was a sin before. So
Well, it's not a sin in the sense of that it's something wrong. It's just one of the problems. For us, when we think about sin, we almost always think about sin as right and wrong. It's about something I did wrong. So in that sense, we see sin as a legal problem, right? And if I got pulled over by a policeman for driving too fast, that's a legal problem, and it might have been just me keeping up with traffic and him being mean, and I got pulled over. I don't feel like a particularly bad man. I just feel grateful when he doesn't ticket me. But
I was just a little confused because when you said that, and then you said it wasn't even your fault, and I wondered how it was sin.
It wasn't. It's sin. St. Paul's his working the closest thing to a working definition in Paul's letters of sin is death. Sin is death at work in us. The process of death at work in us. It separates us from others. What's interesting about shame is that as emotions go, shame is the emotion that separates us from communion, from other people. You go to that party and you don't feel like you belong, and you just feel not only alienated, or if you feel like you really don't belong, you can even confuse you and yourself. You're just not certain at all. It can be very, very upsetting. Being that new person in school, you walk in that first day halfway through the year and everybody knows you, and somebody in the back makes some joke that you didn't get to hear, and there's chuckles in the back of the room, and now you're really worried, and you're already imagining in your mind what they might be laughing at. Well, you didn't do anything wrong. And yet in that moment, what's going on in you is a process that will likely feed most of the wrong things you do in your life. This brokenness that happens. It's like the Orthodox treatment of sin is treating it like it's a process at work in us, not a legal problem. God's not a lawyer. The church is not a court. The church, we say, is a hospital for sinners, which is to say sin is more like a disease. And shame is actually a kind of root cause in a lot of these diseases. It can make somebody, say, goes into the party, feels a little bit, me, for instance, feels a little uncomfortable. I'm very unlikely not to leave. I'm much more likely to make an ass of myself, to kind of overact and, go ahead and be the life of the party, draw all the attention to me, because that's how I dealt with it. I mean, I was a class clown because I was the smallest boy in the class. And if you can make them laugh, they won't hit you. It's funny, my first childhood friend in grammar school was a boy who bullied me on the playground. And I've later as an adult thought, what the heck was wrong with me that I decided my best friend until I finished high school was a guy that I met because he was bullying me and calling me bad names and making fun of me. Well, I look back at it and I can take you through my, psychiatrist notes and tell you, because I was a second born son and I'd learned to do that with my older brother. So the guy's going to beat me up on the playground must be like my older brother. Says, I'll love you, hit me, and I'll at least make you laugh or something. Well, it's sick. It can also make you do lots of wrong things and things that aren't healthy. You don't even know how to ask the healthy questions. To be actually who you really are, instead of reacting to all of these things that are making you dance this playground dance that isn't who you are. To actually be able to say to your friend, you've always treated me like a piece of crap, and I don't like it. We're not going to do that, and I'm not going to put up with that anymore. That's healthy. But, I wish I could have learned that in high school. It would have been healthier, but I didn't. So we're bringing these things, we're kind of, when we're looking at it, we're not talking about something I did wrong, but something that's at work in me. And this is a medicine to begin to heal it so that I can actually be comfortable with me when I pray. I mean, we import all of that shame into God, for instance. People will talk about praying and they feel like God is judging them, and they think I just, when I don't feel I can lift my eyes and praying, and it's like God's your biggest enemy when he's like your closest friend. So this is but it's a good point, and it's one to visit with a lot more, because a lot of things won't make sense in Orthodoxy if we're thinking about sin as a legal problem, things I did wrong. I mean, we'll say on Sunday before taking communion, I don't know exactly how the prayer goes in Antiochian practice, but we'll confess ourselves to be the worst of sinners, the sinners of whom I am chief. We quote St. Paul on that. Well, I don't know about you, but legally, I just don't feel like that's true of me. I'm bad, but I know several people in my congregation that are a lot worse. And I know a lot of priests, it's like, and if we're going to get legal about it, I'm bringing my lawyer. Let's check this thing out. So it can't mean that. When we say it, it can't be meaning that. So what does it mean when Paul says of sinners of whom I am chief, and we get to say that we're all competing for that same position? Paul is actually confessing his humility. He's confessing before God oh God, I was killing Christians. I'm not worthy. He's the prodigal son. I'm not worthy to be called your son. Just let me be a hired hand, eat your pig food or something. Take me back. And, did the younger son do something wrong? A lot of people like to talk about the sins of the younger son. We don't know exactly that he did anything wrong. He got his inheritance. The father sent him out with the inheritance. The father didn't say, well, that's an insult. But the father practiced humility. The father should have been shamed by what his younger son did to him. And instead, the younger son, he sees him at a distance and he comes running to him. The father shames himself, if you will. He humbles himself before his son. Like the best thing that's ever happened to him in his life is this young son. And it upsets the older son who said, you never even gave me, nothing. The older son's got his own shame because he's feeling you love him more than you love me. After my parents died, my older brother said to me once, they loved you more than they loved me. And I said to him, yes, and you love me more too. And that's why I'm the one in therapy. I said, you actually have no idea how crazy it can make you to be the favorite son. You thought that was really neat, but it's not. It'll make you crazy. And it can also make you a priest, and then it can also make you a crazy priest. And I've been all three. So and I'm still working on one of them. But it's not so much that you've done something wrong. We don't have a legal problem with God. We have something much more like a medical problem. We have this process at death that's very secretive. It's sneaky. It works, in all of these ways. And yet God has come into it. And it's like, you can't think of anything you feel bad about that he hasn't taken to himself. I mean, it's just, who was he hanging out with? He was hanging out with people you should be ashamed to hang out with. I mean, they bring that woman in the 8th chapter of John, taken in adultery, drag her out in the street. She's probably sweaty and all of that. They caught her in the act and they bring her out, and Jesus treats her like it was his mother or something. And he protects her. He covers her. When we make our confession, the priest covers us. It's another clothing image. He covers us. It's with the robe of Christ. We're being covered, hidden from the world, hidden from our sins, hidden from our shame, and clothed. With a sort of word of worthiness to us. So that's a long answer, but it's actually a huge question, a very important question. It took me some years coming at it to figure, how did that make sense?
It's a wonderful answer, Paul.
I hope it's useful. Seem right, you guys? Okay, right enough. All right. Anyway, I worried about that. I was in a moral theology class when I was in seminary, and it was sort of very Catholic style moral theology, and it was kind of legal stuff like that. And then I was in this other class on soteriology, and that professor had done his doctorate under Florowski at Harvard, and we're reading Orthodox stuff. And so I'm reading this Orthodox stuff, and it's just so very, we're reading like Gustav Alain on the atonement. He's talking about the Christus Victor models, very different from the West. And I'm reading that, and I'm thinking, these two things don't go together. And that puzzled me, and I graduated with that puzzle, until I began to read Orthodoxy. And then I went, oh, the West was wrong. Never mind. So, very helpful. Yes.
So what you were saying about being the chief of sinners, I guess you would apply that, would you, to the canon, the great canon of St. Andrew? When we're
Oh, absolutely.
confessing all these things,
Yeah.
being worse than.
Yeah. I mean, when I'm doing the canon of St. Andrews, to a sense, there ain't nobody else in the room. And it's interesting. Nothing else is written. It's almost all in the first person singular. It's like St. Andrew's saying this stuff. And I did an article some years back called The Erotic Language of Prayer, Eros, the language of desire. And a lot of the times you read these prayers of the church and you forget these are written by saints. And it's not They're written by saints, therefore they're the perfect prayers. They're written by saints, and therefore they're crazy. Saint Isaac of Syria talks about it as eros manikos, God's manic love for us. And so we have these prayers, and they're oftentimes written by Greeks who are not English. And so they say things in an outlandish way, like, it just flows, and it's extreme language. I tell people, I'm awful about this, but that if you read Lives of the Saints written by Greeks, divide by 10. I'm not saying they're not true, but they just do write them very effusively, and someone once asked me, but well, what about the English? And I said, well, that's my people. That's who I'm from. If Jesus had come to England instead of the Holy Land, where he had Greeks and Jews, we would have icons, but instead of kissing them, like the Greeks and Jews kiss everything, as Englishmen, we would have apologized and felt uncomfortable with the icons, because that's how the English are. If you've ever apologized to a piece of furniture, you might be English. And we're sort of uptight with that kind of stuff. And I've just watched this latest episode of All Creatures Great and Small. And the two brothers are standing at the train, they're taking leave, and one of them hugs the other one. He said, so we're huggers now? And he's so uncomfortable. And I thought, this is so inaccurate. There's no way they would have hugged. I mean, I remember the program Foyle's War. His son's going off to fly Spitfires against the Germans, and they stand in the living room and they can barely shake hands. And the last thing they can do is admit that they love each other. And I'm thinking, oh, that's it. I remember my brother came home from the Navy in his first time out at sea, and he came in through the door, and I don't know who he had been hanging out with on board the boat, but he came in the front door, grabbed my father and kissed him on the lips. And I thought, I am going to leave. I mean, that's not only wrong, it's gross. And my father may never recover from this. What have you done? I've been hanging out with people from New Jersey or something. I don't know Italian. So, his daughter married an Italian from New Jersey. That was a different wedding. But, they hugged a lot and danced and sang Frank Sinatra things. It was very odd, but it's just not English at all. So I remember my daughter Mary got married, and we had the reception at her uncle's church, who was a very, very strong Presbyterian. There was no alcohol and there was no dancing. And as my son said, and there was no fun. And so, but, so there is that about it that has this kind of language. I mean, I have a theory that the English love the Russians. They do. I mean, like Dostoevsky is reading him is like this pipeline to your heart. Interesting, the Russians love Charles Dickens the way we love Dostoevsky, and that's fascinating. But they do. But there's this we're swimming in foreign waters in this language and stuff, and oftentimes you can hear this stuff being read in the services and the prayers, and you can feel kind of distant from it, as in, A, I would never say it that way, and B, I don't think I've ever felt that. And I tried to talk about that in an article, recognize, consider the source, and don't, it might even, like when and it may very well be in your own prayers, like you're doing the morning prayers, and you're reading the written morning prayers, and you're reading them, and you're thinking, and you come back and say, I feel awful because I don't think I mean any of these things. And I think, well, of course you don't mean it. You never talked to anyone like that in your life. It's a little easier for the English if they use like the Book of Common Prayer. Somehow or another, it's more restrained in that way. But I think there's an aspect to that of that to us, and that's part of the mix that's going on now of Orthodoxy meeting America. I mean, we're not going to change the language, but the language is going to change us. But also, it is the language of extravagance, of an erotic language. You watch My Big Fat Greek Wedding, that movie. It came out the year my first daughter got married. We saw that movie. Her in-laws were Baptist missionaries. And my wife said, for God's sake, don't let them watch this movie. And you know, they didn't, but it rang so close to what was going on, at least in the wedding, that, you know, so these are things to adjust ourselves on. And I think it is helpful for us to admit that. It's like, gee, it's okay to say, I feel uncomfortable when I'm praying this, and not think you're wrong or sinful. It's like, this is a cultural experience that's foreign to me. People ask, is it okay for me to pray in my own language? As if God would ever tell us not to. You know, we have written prayers to help us learn how to pray, but they are not our substitutes for just talking to God. I use one, as Paul says, he'll pray in tongues and he'll pray with understanding. So I'll pray in the tongues of Greeks and of angels, you know, or Arabs, as you know, as they give me these written materials. But I'll also pray in my English language. And it dawned on me once I was in the altar, and all of my OCA prayers are thee and thou, you know, and I'm in the altar, and I thought, you know, I never talked to God like that. I've been talking to him all my life. And so I translated all of my priestly prayers in the altar, the silent prayers, into your, just because I want to feel close to Jesus when I'm saying these things, and not like I'm thee and thouing him from a distance. You know, it's just my private things. The priest has to pray in the altar, but I wanted them, you know, I wanted to make it work for me. As I say, and usually Christ is going to give us enough shame experiences elsewhere that I don't have to make them up. But someone once told me that a priest is allowed to make 7 mistakes each liturgy, and it was a Greek probably told me that, they would say that, and they know everything. And one Greek priest told me, he said, you knew you got 4 angels, extra angels assigned to you and you ordained. And I thought, I had no idea. He said, oh yes, you've got a guardian, but you've got 3 like professionals with you for your priesthood. 4 others. I'm thinking, what do you use them for? You know? So I've sent them when I'm doing the proscomedy and the prayers, and I'm looking and I haven't seen somebody in church for several weeks. I would send one of those angels, said, go get them and bring them. Tell their guardian angel to wake them up and get them here. You'd be surprised how many times they show up. Saying, that must be what they're for. But, you know, there's the things they don't tell you. They just don't. They should have like a manual of stuff, the really cool stuff. You know? But, you know, Orthodoxy is hands down the most fun form of Christianity, because we've never thrown anything out and we've kept it, you know, and it's just learning to do it. But it is difficult when you come into it, because there's so much awkwardness and feeling like I don't know what I'm doing, or everybody might look at me, or I might do it wrong, you know, all kinds of things like that. And I mean, part of me wants to tell people, of course you're going to do it wrong. You know, that's part of its joy. And, you know, I get 7 mistakes of liturgy. You at least get that many, you know? And so, and I do my best to make my quota every time. So, and now that I'm a retired assistant priest, I have someone to point them out to me. Oh dear, it's hard. So you do that for you, Father? No, yeah. Oh, that's good, yeah. Yeah. So there was a priest once who was doing in the altar, and he did something a particular way. And when the bishop visited, he corrected him. But this priest was a great holy priest. And every time he served, he could see his guardian angel with him serving. And so the next Sunday, he says to his guardian angel, so the bishop told me that was wrong. Why didn't you tell me? He said, oh, I'm only an angel. I can't correct a priest. So there's that. So that's not what the professional ones do for you. So there's no help. They go out for fetching wayward parishioners. But, you know, if I could say anything tonight on this wonderful fruit of the Spirit, God has shed his grace on us. And if you've been wondering why he hasn't just suddenly taken all that shame away, he has a use for it. He has a use for it. To work in us. St. Paul said, you know, we have this treasure in earthen vessels. And God, through these broken things, is working in us the eternal inheritance of our salvation. Paul became a fool for Christ for our sake. The apostles all became, he said, like the offscourings of the earth. And they do that. Sometimes we're so fancy in the Orthodox Church, and our services can be so elaborate and beautiful that we forget that's what that's about. But part of it is we miss the irony of this, is that we take these doofuses and ordain them. Forgive me, my brother doofuses, or doufoi, use the Greek plural. I mean, I know you guys. And he puts us up there and dresses us up like God. He puts the robes of God on you and tells you stand in the place of Christ. And you and I both know that no matter how many times they say axios, we're not, and it's, and what a joy is that if that's true for us, then salvation can be true for all. And it's God doing the same thing, robing us through our humility, robing us in glory. So good to be with you and good to share with y'all tonight. Y'all take good care of my son-in-law and my daughter and my granddaughter. So, amen. You're welcome.